with recommendation 1, I just want to make sure I have my numbers right here, so let me hold this as well. We talked about this one as having the minimal evidence, and I'll explain why within this, okay? So we know academic language refers to kind of the formal structures that you see more commonly in print, text, and instruction that happens in schools. It's the language, the more sophisticated words that are used in that text or in school or in classes, even as you get older that you attend, as opposed to more social type of language. So the more social type of language, because it's happening around us all the time, kids tend to learn naturally as they're growing up. But as they're growing up in those years before they enter kindergarten, it is less likely that they hear this formal academic kind of structure. And kids who enter kindergarten with lower levels of academic language tend to become poorer readers. So it's one of the reasons that, and kids who have higher academic language become better readers. So it's one of the reasons that we are interested in academic language and what we can do to help all kids obtain that language to help them become a better reader. So recommendation 1 has 3 actions, and the idea is to teach students those academic language skills, and we talked about earlier the inferential language, so thinking about how you incorporate your background knowledge into events that are happening, to think critically or to problem solve or to take a perspective. And narrative language, which is being able to identify events that are happening and put them in a sequence and explain those events and the sequence of events. And then, of course, your vocabulary. And academically, we're talking about a more sophisticated level of vocabulary than happens just in their discussions with peers, or even that they might hear some adults just socially talking about might be a little bit less sophisticated than what we see in text regularly. So the evidence that was found by the panel related to this recommendation included just 7 studies. So that's one of the reasons that it's not the strong evidence. There's not a lot of studies that have looked at this academic language. And there are mixed findings in those studies. And so that's where you end up with the evidence level that we have. So 3 of the studies that examined what happens when you teach either inferential language, narrative language, vocabulary, or a combination of those, had positive outcomes on students' vocabulary. So that's something to pay attention to. But there were also 3 studies that did not find any gain in vocabulary. Now that doesn't mean gain from, they're still improving in their vocabulary, but bump over just typical instruction that was already going on. Remember we talked about those high quality studies are looking at if you do this in addition to or in comparison to typical instruction, does it give you even more gain for your students? So when there's no differences, it doesn't mean that a student didn't gain from like pre-test to post-test, but they didn't gain more than they normally would have with any kind of instruction. Does that make sense? Okay. So there are mixed findings. Sometimes some of the studies found we can improve the students' vocabulary, and some didn't find any additional gain in those vocabulary levels. Some of them looked at listening comprehension. And another reason that the evidence level is at the level that it is that it did not find any, again, additional gain related to listening comprehension. Now, the panel looked at those carefully, and one of the problems that we have with only these 7 studies is that these studies have gone on for a fairly short amount of time. And if you want to see gain in comprehension, you usually need, at least with our assessments, their sensitivity level, you need a pretty robust intervention before you start to see those additional bumps in comprehension with our current assessments. So part of the reason that this still is a recommendation is it looks like we have mixed findings on the vocabulary level, and we need more studies that look at this over time. So that's also why the recommendation is to do this at all grade levels. So if we are doing this consistently across grade levels, given the correlations that we see between students who do have higher academic language becoming better readers, there is certainly more work that we need to do in terms of studying this, but we would expect that if we can really start to affect these students' vocabulary, as some of the students found, and some of their language broader in terms of that we would expect it to start affecting their comprehension. So that's where the recommendation comes from, and that's also why the evidence level is still at the minimal evidence, though, because we do need more studies related to that. So the 3 action steps for the studies that that we're finding positive findings are to engage students in conversations that support the use and comprehension of inferential language. So again, this is at the language level. We're trying to build their thinking process and their general language so that that will then transfer to print and reading comprehension. And obviously, this is more at the listening and speaking level. So we are talking about the overall language here with inferential language. When I was a second grade teacher, I mean, sometimes kids would come in from recess complaining about what went on at recess, and I would say to some of those students, well, why do you think that happened? Or why do you think that Jose did that? And literally they couldn't tell me, and it was a really obvious scenario. If you can't think about the events around you and use inferencing on things that go on in your day-to-day life, how are we expecting kids to do that when they read a story that's abstract and isn't even happening in their actual life, right? So we want to build this language and this inferencing ability or this narrative ability just in their general lives and thinking so that we can then apply it to text. Action step 2 then is related to the narrative aspect. Again, events happening, what happened yesterday, what happened today, what was the sequence of events, and taking that also to abstract levels but within language. So it doesn't necessarily later have to be something that happened to them, but what can we describe this as? And what are the events and what sequence do those get put in? And then, of course, improving students' vocabulary and their overall language, so the more sophisticated words, and particularly academic types of words that might go on in any content area, not just in English, language arts, but science and social studies and all kinds of different areas to build both their background knowledge and their knowledge of word structures and word meanings that they can then apply to text.
When we look at the vocabulary, and like Jeannie was talking about building that language, that's hard, isn't it? Like when we're talking about those instructional components that I covered earlier, and we're talking about providing that deliberate and frequent practice to students, that is hard when we're talking about building language because they need a lot of miles on their tongue in order for them to build that language. And then when we're working with students of diverse languages or diverse populations, it's even harder, you know, on how they're doing that. So we're going to talk about some of these activities with each of the recommendations. Some of the activities are right in the practice guide, and I'll tell you which ones. And then some of them, not so much with this first one, but some of them on the other recommendations aren't in the practice guide. We kind of wanted to give you a mix of those. But let's go ahead and look at these. The next slide that we have is really just a diagram of that academic language, and this is right in the practice guide as well. So if you look at this slide that's in there, it's building that language. And again, those areas that Jeannie was talking about from the evidence of the research that we need to build is in there. More importantly, though, let's go and look at how we can do that and exactly what that looks like for each of these. So I want you to look at these questions, and this diagram is right in the practice guide. So if you go back and you forgot about it and you have that practice guide as you're looking in those collaborative learning teams. So let's look at inferential language and discussion and how can we build that in order for students to make those connections in their comprehension. So how do these questions start? How do they start? What are the words? What do they start with? Why? What? How? Right? I think we covered it. And then can you, right? Can you imagine? So we're asking them, you know, to do something. So that's one thing I really want you to highlight that to begin with is how we ask a question is going to help get them to that inferential language and guiding them through. So we can look at ideas for informational text and we could look at ideas for narrative text. Now, if I said to them, if we're reading a book about birds, and informational text. And so then I say, why do birds fly south for the winter? And I'm delivering the instruction. How are we expecting students to respond? And I want you to think of those instructional components. So just talk at your table for about 1 minute. How would we get all students practicing that? Some idea. So go ahead and just talk at your table. All right, everybody attention back. I heard a lot of great discussions at the table. We have to prime background to begin with, right? We can't just start by asking them a question about why do birds fly south. We have to somehow prime their background and make sure that students are understanding what they already read or that they have the background. I heard somebody talk about making sure that the students restate the question. Right? If they can't understand what the question is or haven't heard it, then they're not going to be able to answer using the language that we're trying to promote. I heard a lot of people say giving them opportunities to think and develop their response. So again, that think time, that wait time as we go through, making sure that students are talking in complete languages, making sure that you're providing those models for students of what that inferential language looks like, and doing guided questions as you go through as well. So not only thinking about what is it how we can facilitate that inferential language, but what that looks like. We need to make close that gap for students to make sure that we're delivering that instruction so that students are building the language following these types of questions as well. All right, let's go ahead and go on then to action step 2. In action step 2, we want to explicitly engage students in developing narrative language skills. So they need to be able to understand the sequence, right, and use language in order to develop the narrative language skills as well. So let's look at the first thing. It says predict, right? So we're going back to predict, discuss earlier predictions, describe the scene in a picture. So a scene in the picture is going to be related to an event in narrative text, right? So being able to describe what's happening in the story, explain how to do something, and again, that's going to be related to what? It's going to be related to them understanding a narrative text structure, is being able to describe a sequence of events. So make sure that you're always tying it back to that. Identify when a given element is used in read aloud. So if we think about the narrative text structure and we think about character, setting, what happened first, what happened in the middle, what happened at the end, problem, solution, all of those different elements that happen, and having them identify that through read alouds. Summarize story of factual information using graphic organizers. So again, if we're going to have them use a graphic organizer, we need to explain the objective. We need to model what that looks like as we're using a graphic organizer. We need to provide opportunities for students to do the we do as we do it together, and the we do some more, and the we do some more, and then get to the point that they're able to do the graphic organizers where they're using that narrative language as well. And then the last one, summarize or relate the main idea, events, or other specific details of a passage. So in a minute, we're going to look at a video that is talking about the main idea and how we'll be watching for ways that the teacher is doing that objective, but facilitating the use of that narrative language. By the way, in case I forget to say it in a little bit, there's with the facilitator's guide, there's a website that there are numerous videos that you can watch. Just like we're going to do a couple today, but I think there's something like 25 or 30. I mean, there's numerous ones, and I will say some better than others, that are on there. But at least a way that you can watch how this looks within a classroom and give you ideas, on how you can help students with that. Okay, this is one of my very favorite ones that's in the practice guide. So you do have this table in the practice guide that's in there. I should have what page number it is, and I don't. But I love how it breaks down, and for me as a teacher, and as I'm looking at how I'm facilitating that discussion, it's one of the best visuals So again, when you're in those learning communities and you're talking about this, if we're talking about description, sequence, problem and solution, cause and effect, compare and contrast, this is how we can facilitate that language for the students. It gives you an example of what that can look like and how you can ask those questions of the students. So I would flag this chart. So when you're talking about how we're increasing this narrative language with students, talk about these examples that you see in here, and then look at a read aloud that you're doing and how it can fit right with that read aloud based on what are those strategies that you're working on with the students and how you can facilitate more language with your students. So it's one of the easiest ones I think that I've seen as to use that's on there. All right. The other thing is grammatical structures. So this is also in your practice guide. So you have this table in there as well. It gives you a great description of each of those and also an example. So another way of making sure that you're increasing that language use of students and how you're going to do that and how you're going to facilitate it. So I'm not going to spend too much time with this one as well, but it's that idea of what are those grammatical structures that we need to use with our students and what does that mean? And what are some examples? So again, thinking about in those learning collaboration team meetings that you have, one of your meetings could be devoted to the grammatical structures. And then let's look at an upcoming text that we're using with our students and what are some ways that we can facilitate building those structures with our students in their language. Uh-huh. We'll look it up and see if we can find it. It's not in the practice guide? Oh. It might be, I'll look in the facilitator's guide in that activity in there too. We'll find it for you and make sure, and if not, we'll make sure that you guys get a full-size copy of it, that you have it in there as well. Thank you for bringing that up. Oh, that could be. All right, elements of linguistic structure then would be another area that's also part of the narrative language skills. So the connectives, noun phrases, verb phrases, pronoun references. And again, with our primary students, we don't need to say, we're going to work on our pronoun references today, right? We can say, we're going to work on discussing the story to get to a deeper meaning, and get to that comprehension. How can we, as educators, then facilitate what that looks like? So if we look at the pronoun references, providing clear references. Tommy was sick, so his mom made soup with her brand new pot. And then you can talk about who are we talking about when we say his, who are we talking about when we say her, having students practice using sentences, with the pronouns. How many of you work with second language learners? This is hard for them, isn't it? Pronouns is really hard for them. But how many times when they're reading text are pronouns being used? A lot, right? So it's that being really intentional about having that as part of that instruction and that practice that students are using during that language. So again, another item of your learning communities could be, let's practice adding in more of those linguistic structure opportunities for students to practice. Step 3, teach academic vocabulary in the context of other reading activities. So you'll be looking at the main idea video. So they're talking about main idea, which is comprehension strategy, right? So they're talking about main idea, but we can have students using that other language, as they're going through. So academic vocabulary consists of words that are common in formal settings. Locate, define, select, contrast, estimate, concentrate. So we can teach students what those words mean, and when we're using those, use that higher level academic vocabulary with students so that we're raising their ability to use that language themselves and understand what those mean. Wouldn't that be great if all of our kindergarten students could understand how to use each of these as they're talking about text? You know, so often we like to go right to talking about comprehension, but if we don't develop this language as these foundational skills, we're keeping kids from getting to those deeper meaning. So a great activity in your learning communities as well is to talk about how are we increasing the amount of academic language that we're teaching at each of the grades, or what that looks like, and be really intentional about making sure that we've got a set of words that we're going to be teaching at each of the grades and we're going to be using with the students in our instruction, and asking our students to also use those vocabulary, academic vocabulary, word and language. I had one school that I worked with, and they took this recommendation and this academic vocabulary, and they made a list for each grade level. By the end of kindergarten, the students will not only know what the list means for that grade level, but they'll all be able to use it within the context of reading activities. First grade, what are we going to do at first grade that's going to build on where we started at kindergarten? Second grade, how are we going to build on that academic vocabulary? And that became part of their reading instruction, was building that academic vocabulary as part of their reading activities. So it wasn't, we're going to spend another 30 minutes in our schedule in the day for that we label academic vocabulary. But throughout our instruction, how are we going to make sure that we're increasing that academic vocabulary use for our students? Make sense? So it's a great activity as a school to really think about that and be really intentional within that practice. So what I want you guys to look at then, and I don't think you have this, the copy of the activities in your notebook, but this is a page, and I know you can't see it very well, but this is a page from the activities that go right along with the facilitator's guide. So I want to share with you it. It says, in this video, the teacher explicitly engages students in developing narrative language skills through a lesson on main idea. So I'm going to have you guys watch, and if you'll just take a piece of paper and just do the T. And by the T, I mean just do this bottom part with a line drawn down in the middle. On this side, while you're watching the video, I want you to take notes on exactly what you see the teacher doing. When we're talking on this side, or when we're watching the video, you'll only be writing on the note side. We're going to leave this side for after we watch the video. So what we wanted to show you is what one of the examples in the facilitator's guide looks like. So we'll watch the video. On this side, everybody will write notes. And what I want you to write notes on, what are some ways that a teacher uses questions? So write down questions. Pay particular attention to how they start their question, right? Why, what, how? I mean, listen to those. So write down some examples of that. Write down some examples of how the teacher responds back to a student's response. So once a student responds, how is the teacher facilitating the use of that narrative type of language as they go through? Look at any materials or resources. Look at student engagement. So are all students getting practice? Or are only a few students getting practice? Look at, and in particular, feedback. That's the other one, the corrective feedback. What are ways that the teacher is prompting more use of that? And we can really think of that as that corrective feedback. You know, it's instruction. So if students aren't using that narrative language, how are they prompting the students to go back and use more narrative language as they go through? And so write down notes in those different areas. We'll watch the video, you'll take the notes. Afterwards, then, we'll have an opportunity at your table to talk about what you noticed, what you saw, and then we'll reflect on how is this similar to what's happening in your classrooms, in your schools that you see going on, and what are some ways that we can improve what we're doing with the narrative language, okay? All right, let me set this up.
Knowing the main idea of what we read helps us to better understand and remember what we read. So when we are going to find out the main idea of a picture or a story, we can follow 3 steps. I've written them up on our chart. First step to determining the main idea is to identify the most important who or what in that photo or story. Who or what is it mostly about? Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. So we found who or what the story or photo is mostly about. Now we need to know the information about that who or what. And step number 3 is to write or say that information in one short sentence. We're going to try and say in 10 words or less. So we're going to practice today using a photo. So I want us to look at step number 1. Step number 1 is to identify the most important who or what in this photo. Thumb on your knee. You think you found the most important who or what in this photo. Owen?
The girl in the white dress.
Why do you think the girl in the white dress is the most important who or what?
Because she's the only one that's wearing the white dress.
Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. I'm going to give you some think time. So we said the most important who or what is the girl in the white dress. Thumb on your knee if you'd like to share the most important information about the who or what. Aiden?
The most important thing about the who and what is the girl in the white dress getting married.
Who thinks they can help us? Right now we're going to say this information in one short sentence using 10 words or less. That's step number 3. Rachel?
The girl in the white dress is getting married.
Girl in the white dress is getting married. Go ahead and put a thumb on your head if you agree. All right. Now we're going to practice with a different photo, and you're going to talk to your partner about it. I'm going to give you some think time before you turn and talk to your partner. So here's our next photo. Step number 1 is to identify the most important who or what. So I just want you to think. Do you know who the most important who or what is in this photo? Just thinking, that means hands are down, mouths are closed. Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. Step number 3 is to write or say the information in one short sentence, 10 words or less. Go ahead and turn and talk to your partner about this photo. What's number 2? What's step number 2? Step number 1? Okay, who or what is the most important in this photo?
That Miss Angela is graduated from high school.
It looks like you already did step number 3. You put all of your information into one sentence. I heard the who or what. That was Miss Andrews, me. And your important information about me is that I'm graduating. And then you put it into one sentence. You can help us share what they and their partner were talking about. Number 1, identify the most important who or what. You can help us with who is the most important or what is the most important. Aiden?
The most important who or what is you graduating with your graduation hat.
Okay, so the most important who you think is me, And you think that because I'm wearing a special hat? Who can help us with number 2, identify the most important information about the who or what? Addison?
Oh, the most important information about who or what is that you're graduating.
Can someone help us to say this information in one short sentence, 10 words or less? Eva?
Miss Andrews is graduating.
Can you say it nice and loud for everyone to hear?
Miss Andrews is graduating.
Go ahead and clap once if you agree with Eva. All right, friends. So as we continue to learn about main idea, you can start to use it when you're reading a story, okay? Good job helping us find the main idea of these pictures.
So let's look at the questions one more time. Hold on. Let me get back to the slide. Not there. Here we go. All right, when we look at the slide that's on here, looking at the lesson delivery. So are there instructional procedures and steps that she used to teach the lesson? Did she provide a model? Did she have clear and explicit explanations? Did she provide guided practice? Did students have an opportunity to practice it on their own? Looking at those different ones, materials and resources, student engagement, feedback, and then focusing on that narrative language. So what I want you to do now for the next few minutes at your table is I want you to share those notes that you wrote down and ways that she was, and pay particular attention to the narrative language, but also pay attention to those other components as well, how we're delivering it. Talk about how this matches what you're doing in your district or in your school or in your buildings, and then talk about what are some ways that we can facilitate more of this narrative language engagement with students, some action plan ideas of what that could look like. All right, any questions? All right, go ahead and have a discussion. All right, so some really great discussions as I was going around. And obviously the point of what we were showing the video for was talking about how she was facilitating that narrative language through a reading activity, right? Because the reading activity was identifying main idea in there, but how she was facilitating some of those discussions. But one of the things that's really obvious in that, there was a lot of teaching that had gone on before that lesson, right? A lot of teaching. Also, though, a really great discussion in your learning community. Like, what had to happen before you could get to that point in the lesson? Teachers need to be thoughtful planners of a lesson, right? How do you do that planning? How do you engage the students? How do you teach them to answer in a complete sentence, right? We didn't really see her model it, but at some point she had, right? So we would talk about what the model would look like. And also that she did a little bit, it was a little guided practice, in there, not a whole lot of student engagement, to be honest, in that very beginning part. More engagement when she had them turning with their partners, talking about how did she use the partner work and what did that look like. So all of those discussions could happen in just that, watching that little video. So making sure you're closing that gap between what is it we're supposed to be teaching and how are we going to teach it. So that's part of those conversations as well. Everybody, either in your notebook or in your folder, if you got a folder, it doesn't look exactly like this, but there are where it says recommendation 1 and then it says action notes or something like that, I think next to it. I want everybody to pull that page out that you have that has a place for you to write down notes. Tomorrow, what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to give you opportunities to talk more about how you can implement these different recommendations into your school. In preparation for that, so you don't forget what we talked about first thing today, so you don't forget, we're going to give you the next 10 minutes before we break for lunch. Write down what are some actions that you are going to do when you go back to your schools or districts or whatever your role is. Write down some actions of things that you can talk about that you want to do that we have talked about so far this morning in this recommendation 1. So specifically thinking about that inferential language, the narrative language, the academic language, but you can also then talk about how you're going to deliver the instruction as well. So write down a few actions, talk at your table, make sure you have something written down so that tomorrow we can integrate that into your plan.